There is a river in central Italy. Not a great river, not particularly deep, not particularly wide, that cuts through a valley between low green hills. The Romans built a settlement beside it 2,000 years ago and called it Florentia, the flourishing place. For centuries after the empire fell, it was just another small Italian town, unremarkable, unimportant, largely forgotten. And then, sometime around the 13th century, Florence began to make cloth. That sentence does not sound like the beginning of a revolution, but it was. The wool trade transformed Florence from a provincial backwater into one of the wealthiest cities on earth. Raw wool arrived from England and Spain in massive bales. Florentine workshops cleaned it, carded it, dyed it, spun it, and wove it into fabric so fine that aristocrats across Europe would accept no substitute. The process required dozens of specialized steps and hundreds of skilled workers, shearers, dyers, weavers, finishers, organized under powerful trade guilds, the most important of which was the Arte della Lana, the Wool Guild. By the early 1300s, Florence had roughly 100,000 inhabitants, larger than London at the time, and the wool industry employed a staggering portion of them. The city's warehouses were full of English fleece. Its dye vats ran with imported alum and indigo. Its finished cloth traveled by mule train and galley ship to markets in Constantinople, Alexandria, Bruges, and Barcelona. Where there is trade, there is money, and where there is money, there are bankers. Florence did not just make cloth, it made the financial system that moved the money behind the cloth. Florentine bankers pioneered the use of bills of exchange, written instruments that allowed merchants to transfer large sums across borders without physically moving gold. They refined double-entry bookkeeping, the system of debits and credits that remains the foundation of modern accounting. And in 1252, the city minted the gold florin, a coin of such consistent weight and purity that it became the standard currency of European commerce for the next 3 centuries. When a merchant in Bruges wanted to price a shipment, he priced it in florins. When a king in London needed a loan, he borrowed in florins. Florence was not a kingdom. It had no king, no duke, no hereditary ruler. It was a republic, governed, at least in theory, by its citizens. The city's supreme governing body, the Signoria, consisted of 9 men chosen by lottery from the membership of the major guilds. They served for just 2 months at a time, lived together in the Palazzo della Signoria for the duration of their term, and were forbidden from leaving the building without permission. The system was designed to prevent any single family from accumulating permanent power. It did not work, because in a city where wealth was power, the family with the most wealth would always find a way to rule. And by the end of the 14th century, one family had more wealth than anyone else in Florence. Their name was Medici, and they had just opened a bank. The Medici were not aristocrats. They were not descended from ancient Roman senators or feudal lords. They came from the Mugello, a farming valley north of Florence, and their earliest ancestors were, by all evidence, ordinary. The family name itself, Medici, means doctors, though by the time they entered the historical record in the 1200s, they were traders and minor guildsmen, not physicians. The man who changed everything was Giovanni di Bicci de' Medici. Born around 1630, Giovanni was not flashy, not charismatic, not particularly visible in Florentine politics. What he was, with quiet and relentless precision, was a banker. In 1397, he formally established the Medici Bank in Florence, and over the next 3 decades, he built it into the largest financial institution in Europe. The bank's structure was remarkably modern. Rather than operating as a single entity, it functioned as a network of legally separate partnerships, a central holding in Florence, with satellite branches in Rome, Venice, Geneva, Bruges, and London. Each branch had its own manager, its own capital, its own books. If one branch failed, the others were insulated. This was, in essence, an early form of limited liability, a concept that would not be formally codified in law for another 4 centuries. The Rome branch was the most profitable because it handled one of the most lucrative accounts in Christendom, the papal finances. The Vatican collected vast sums from across Europe, tithes, fees, indulgences, taxes, and it needed a bank to move that money. The Medici became the papal bankers, and the revenues were enormous. Giovanni grew enormously wealthy, but he was careful never to flaunt it. He dressed modestly, he avoided public office. He counseled his sons to stay out of sight. "Do not attract attention," he reportedly told them. "Keep out of the public eye." Giovanni died in 1429. His son, Cosimo, inherited the bank, the fortune, and the advice. He ignored the last part. Cosimo de' Medici was a different kind of man, more ambitious, more intellectual, more willing to use his money as a tool of power. He understood something that his father had only intuited, that in a republic where office was assigned by lottery and tenure lasted 2 months, the real power belonged not to whoever held office, but to whoever controlled the men who held office. And control, in Florence, was purchased through patronage. Cosimo spent lavishly, but strategically. He funded churches, monasteries, hospitals, and public buildings. He paid for the restoration of the convent of San Marco, hiring the architect Michelangelo to redesign it entirely, and then stocking its library with manuscripts he had purchased from across Europe. He commissioned paintings, sculptures, and frescoes from the finest artists in the city. He built the Palazzo Medici, a massive stone residence on the Via Larga that was grand enough to impress visiting dignitaries, but restrained enough, just barely, not to provoke accusations of royal pretension. The patronage was not charity. Every chapel built, every artist funded, every manuscript collected created networks of obligation and gratitude that bound the city's elite to Cosimo's orbit. The guilds supported him, the clergy praised him, the common people admired him, and the political class, carefully managed through a combination of generosity and subtle intimidation, deferred to him. In 1433, the rival Albizzi family managed to have Cosimo arrested and exiled. It lasted exactly 1 year. In 1434, a pro-Medici government was elected. Cosimo returned in triumph, and the Albizzi were banished in his place. From that moment until his death in 1464, Cosimo de' Medici was the undisputed master of Florence, without ever holding a formal title or permanent office. He ruled the republic by pretending he did not rule it. The city gave him a title anyway, Pater Patriae, Father of the Fatherland. But Cosimo's most enduring legacy was not political, it was intellectual. Around 1462, he gave a young scholar named Marsilio Ficino a villa near his own estate at Careggi, along with a complete manuscript of Plato's dialogues in Greek. He asked Ficino to translate them into Latin, the first time Plato's full works would be available to Western readers since antiquity. Ficino did so, and the villa became the informal center of what historians would later call the Platonic Academy, a gathering of philosophers, poets, and artists who rediscovered the ideas of ancient Greece and tried to reconcile them with Christianity. This was not an academic exercise, it was the intellectual ignition point of the Renaissance. The idea that human beings had dignity, that the world could be understood through reason, that beauty and knowledge were worthy pursuits in themselves, these ideas, dormant for 1,000 years, came flooding back through the manuscripts that Cosimo's money had rescued from obscurity. The banker had not just bought a city, he had bought a civilization, its memory back. Cosimo's son, Piero, was sickly and ruled for only 5 years before dying in 1469. Power passed to Piero's son, a 20-year-old named Lorenzo, who would become the most famous Medici of them all. Lorenzo de' Medici was not a banker. He was, by temperament and talent, something closer to an artist prince. He wrote poetry, good poetry, admired by serious literary critics of his day. He organized festivals that filled the streets of Florence with pageantry and music. He hunted, jousted, debated philosophy, and charmed diplomats. He was witty, physically vigorous despite chronic health problems, and possessed of an almost supernatural ability to make people feel that they were in the presence of someone extraordinary. He was also, beneath the charm, a ruthless political operator. Lorenzo understood that the Medici's hold on Florence depended on maintaining an intricate balance between the city's merchant families, its guilds, its intellectuals, and the broader population. He managed this balance with a combination of generosity, manipulation, and, when necessary, calculated force. His court became the center of the Italian Renaissance. The list of artists and thinkers who worked under his patronage reads like a catalog of genius. Sandro Botticelli painted The Birth of Venus and Primavera under Medici sponsorship. The young Michelangelo Buonarroti, discovered as a teenage apprentice, was brought into the Medici household and treated almost as a member of the family, eating at Lorenzo's table, studying the ancient sculptures in the Medici gardens, absorbing the atmosphere of classical learning that saturated the palazzo. Leonardo da Vinci, though his relationship with the Medici was more complicated, spent his formative years in the Florence that Lorenzo's patronage had shaped. The philosopher Pico della Mirandola wrote his famous Oration on the Dignity of Man, often called the Manifesto of the Renaissance, while living under Lorenzo's protection. Florence under Lorenzo was a city of perhaps 70,000 people, producing more artistic and intellectual achievement per square mile than any other place in recorded history, and everyone knew who was responsible. But Lorenzo's reign was not without violence. On April 26, 1478, a Sunday, Lorenzo and his younger brother Giuliano attended High Mass at the Cathedral of Santa Maria del Fiore, the great domed church that Brunelleschi had crowned with his impossible cupola decades earlier. The cathedral was packed. The priest raised the host, and at that signal, assassins struck. Giuliano was attacked near the door. Francesco de' Pazzi, a member of a rival banking family, drove a dagger into his chest. Giuliano staggered, fell, and was stabbed again and again, 19 times in all. He died on the cathedral floor, in front of hundreds of worshippers, his blood pooling on the marble. Lorenzo was wounded in the neck, but managed to draw his sword and retreat into the sacristy where his companions barricaded the heavy bronze doors. He survived. The plot, known to history as the Pazzi conspiracy, had been backed by the Pazzi banking family, the Archbishop of Pisa, and, to a degree that remains debated, Pope Sixtus IV himself. It was meant to destroy the Medici and replace them with a more pliant ruling faction. Instead, it destroyed the conspirators. The people of Florence rose up in fury. The Pazzi were hunted through the streets. Francesco de Pazzi was dragged naked from his bed and hanged from a window of the Palazzo della Signoria. The Archbishop of Pisa was hanged beside him, still wearing his vestments. Jacopo de Pazzi, the family patriarch, was beaten, hanged, buried, exhumed, dragged through the streets by a mob, and thrown into the Arno. The Pazzi name was erased from public buildings. Their coat of arms was chiseled from every surface in the city. Lorenzo emerged from the catastrophe more powerful than before. His brother was dead, but the conspiracy's failure had proved, violently and publicly, that Florence would not tolerate any challenge to Medici rule. For the next 14 years, until his death in 1492, Lorenzo governed the city as its undisputed first citizen. He was 43 when he died, worn out by gout, kidney disease, and the relentless demands of managing a city that loved him and resented him in equal measure. On his deathbed, according to some accounts, he was visited by a Dominican friar named Girolamo Savonarola, who offered him no comfort, only condemnation. That friar would soon tear Florence apart. Lorenzo de' Medici's death in 1492 was a hinge point. His son, Piero, called Piero the Unfortunate, a name that tells you everything you need to know, inherited his father's position but none of his father's skill. Where Lorenzo had been subtle, Piero was clumsy. Where Lorenzo had balanced competing factions with surgical precision, Piero blundered through them. In 1494, King Charles VIII of France invaded Italy with a massive army, marching south toward Naples. When the French approached Florentine territory, Piero panicked. He rode out to meet Charles and, without consulting the Signoria or any advisory body, surrendered several key fortresses and agreed to humiliating terms. When he returned to Florence, the city exploded with rage. A mob stormed the Palazzo Medici. Piero and his family fled the city. The Medici Bank, already weakened by years of Lorenzo's neglect of its finances, collapsed. After 60 years of unbroken dominance, the Medici were gone. Into the vacuum stepped Savonarola. Girolamo Savonarola was a Dominican friar from Ferrara, gaunt, intense, burning with prophetic conviction. He had been preaching in Florence since 1990, initially at Lorenzo's own invitation, and his sermons had grown steadily more radical. He denounced the corruption of the church. He condemned the vanity and luxury of Florentine society. He predicted divine punishment, plague, invasion, fire, and when the French army actually arrived, his followers believed he had been proved right. After the Medici's expulsion, Savonarola became the dominant voice in Florence. He was not a political office holder, he was a monk, but his sermons packed the cathedral, his followers controlled the government, and his moral authority was, for a time, absolute. He declared that Florence would become a new Jerusalem, a city purified by faith and governed by Christian virtue. The most dramatic expression of his vision came on February 7, 1497, the bonfire of the vanities. In the Piazza della Signoria, the same square where the Pazzi conspirators had been hanged, Savonarola's followers built an enormous pyre. Onto it they threw mirrors, cosmetics, fine dresses, playing cards, musical instruments, secular books, and paintings, including, according to some accounts, works by Botticelli. The fire burned for hours. The crowd sang hymns. The Renaissance, or at least its material expression, was being fed to the flames. But Savonarola overreached. He attacked Pope Alexander VI, the Borgia Pope, with increasing ferocity, calling him a false shepherd and demanding a church council to depose him. Alexander responded by excommunicating Savonarola and threatening Florence with an interdict which would have cut the city off from all sacraments. Florentine opinion, already divided, turned against the friar. In April 1498, a mob attacked the convent of San Marco, where Savonarola was sheltered. He was arrested, tortured, and forced to confess to various charges. On May 23, 1498, Girolamo Savonarola was hanged in the Piazza della Signoria, and his body was burned. His ashes were thrown into the Arno, the same river that had received the battered corpse of Jacopo de' Pazzi 20 years earlier. Florence was a republic again, but it was a republic in crisis. Without the Medici's money and without Savonarola's faith, the city drifted. It was during this uncertain period that a former government official named Niccolò Machiavelli, dismissed from office, arrested, tortured, and exiled to his country farm after the Medici returned, sat down and wrote a short book about power. He dedicated it to Lorenzo de' Medici's grandson, hoping to regain favor. The book was called The Prince. It would become the most famous treatise on political power ever written, and it was born directly from the wreckage of Medici Florence. The Medici did not stay gone. In 1512, with the help of a Spanish army and papal pressure, the family returned to Florence. The Republic was over, in practice, if not yet in name. But this time, the Medici would not be content with the quiet, unofficial dominance that Cosimo and Lorenzo had practiced. This time, they aimed higher. Lorenzo the Magnificent, for all his brilliance, had understood something crucial. The Medici's position in Florence was always fragile. They were citizens, not princes. Their power depended on networks of patronage that could be dismantled, on political alliances that could shift, on public opinion that could turn hostile overnight. The expulsion of 1494 had proved how quickly everything could collapse. The solution, Lorenzo had decided, was to embed the family in an institution that was older, more powerful, and more permanent than any Italian city-state: the church. Lorenzo had placed his second son, Giovanni, in the clergy at the age of 7. By 13, he was a cardinal, the youngest in history at the time. Lorenzo had pulled every string, called in every favor, and spent enormous sums to secure the appointment. On his deathbed, he reportedly told Giovanni, "You are the first cardinal the family has had. Remember that you are going to serve the church, not the church to serve you." Giovanni remembered the first part. He ignored the second. In 1513, Giovanni de' Medici was elected Pope Leo X. He was 37 years old, fond of hunting, music, theater, and extravagant banquets. Upon his election, he is said to have remarked, "God has given us the papacy, let us enjoy it." And enjoy it he did. Leo X's pontificate was a golden explosion of art, spectacle, and spending. He commissioned Raphael to paint the Vatican apartments. He patronized musicians, poets, and scholars on a scale that rivaled and perhaps exceeded his father's court in Florence. He staged elaborate theatrical productions, organized hunts in the Vatican gardens with tame leopards, and threw banquets where the guests ate on gold plates. The money had to come from somewhere. Leo spent the entire papal treasury within 2 years of his election. Then he borrowed massively from the great banking houses, from cardinals, from anyone who would lend. And when borrowing was not enough, he accelerated the sale of indulgences, certificates that promised the buyer reduced time in purgatory. Dominican and Franciscan friars fanned out across Europe, selling salvation by the sheet. In a small German town, a monk named Martin Luther watched this with growing horror. In 1517, Luther nailed his 95 Theses to the door of the castle church in Wittenberg, attacking the sale of indulgences as a corruption of Christian doctrine. Leo X initially dismissed Luther as a minor irritant, a drunken German, he reportedly said, who will change his mind when he sobers up. He was wrong. Luther did not change his mind. The Reformation, one of the most consequential ruptures in Western history, was triggered in large part by a Medici pope's inability to stop spending money. Leo X died in 1521, reportedly of a sudden fever, though poison was whispered. The papacy briefly left Medici hands, but in 1523, Giulio de' Medici, Lorenzo the Magnificent's nephew, the illegitimate son of the Giuliano who had been murdered in the cathedral, was elected Pope Clement VII. Where Leo had been cheerful and extravagant, Clement was cautious and unlucky. He attempted to navigate the treacherous politics of a Europe now split between the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V and the French King Francis I. He misjudged badly. In 1527, an unpaid imperial army, German landsknechts and Spanish soldiers, marched on Rome and sacked the city with a ferocity that had not been seen since the Visigoths. For weeks, Rome burned, churches were looted, cardinals were ransomed. The Pope himself was trapped in the Castel Sant'Angelo, watching from the ramparts as the city that he was supposed to shepherd was torn apart below him. The sack of Rome in 1527 is often cited as the symbolic end of the High Renaissance, the age of confidence, beauty, and humanist optimism. The age the Medici had done so much to create was consumed in fire and chaos, and a Medici pope stood helpless at its center. Back in Florence, news of the sack triggered yet another anti-Medici revolt. The family was expelled again, another republic was declared, but this one too would be short-lived. In 1530, Clement VII allied himself with Emperor Charles V, and an imperial army besieged Florence for 10 months. The city fell, the Republic was abolished, and this time the Medici returned not as unofficial first citizens, but as hereditary rulers. In 1532, Alessandro de' Medici, widely rumored to be Clement VII's illegitimate son, was installed as the first Duke of Florence. The republic that had existed, in some form, for over 2 centuries was formally dead. The city that had invented modern banking, modern art patronage, and modern political theory was now a duchy, ruled by a family of bankers who had turned themselves into princes. Alessandro was assassinated by his own cousin in 1537. Power passed to a distant relative, Cosimo I, who proved to be a capable and ruthless ruler. He conquered Siena, expanded Florentine territory across Tuscany, and in 1569 was granted the title Grand Duke of Tuscany by the Pope. The Medici would hold that title for another century and a half. But the fire was going out. The later Medici Grand Dukes were, with a few exceptions, mediocrities. The family that had produced Cosimo the Elder, Lorenzo the Magnificent, 2 popes, and 2 queens of France now produced a succession of undistinguished rulers who presided over a gradually declining economy. The great bank was long gone. The artistic energy that had made Florence the center of the world had dispersed to Rome, Venice, and beyond. Tuscany became a provincial backwater again, beautiful, drowsy, and irrelevant. The last Medici ruler was Gian Gastone, who died in 1737, obese, alcoholic, and largely bedridden. He left no heir. The Grand Duchy of Tuscany passed by prior agreement among the European powers to the House of Lorraine, a branch of the Habsburg family. The Medici dynasty, after more than 3 centuries, was over. But there was one Medici left. Anna Maria Luisa de' Medici was Gian Gastone's sister, the last surviving member of the main line. She had married the Elector Palatine of the Rhine, lived abroad for years, and returned to Florence as a widow. She watched the family's power drain away. She watched foreign diplomats carve up her family's inheritance, and she understood, with the clarity that perhaps only the last of a dynasty can possess, that the most important thing the Medici had ever produced was not power, not wealth, not political influence. It was art. On October 31st, 1737, Anna Maria Luisa de' Medici signed a document that would be known as the Patto di Famiglia, the family pact. In it, she bequeathed the entirety of the Medici art collection to the state of Tuscany, on one absolute condition: none of it could ever be removed from Florence. Think about what that collection contained. Paintings by Botticelli, Leonardo, Raphael, Titian, Caravaggio, sculptures by Michelangelo and Donatello, thousands of manuscripts, maps, scientific instruments, jewels, and antiquities accumulated over 300 years by a family that had spent more money on art than most nations spent on war. The Uffizi Gallery, the Pitti Palace, the Biblioteca Lorenziana, all of it bound to Florence forever by the signature of one woman who understood that the collection was not her property to scatter. It belonged to the city. It belonged to the world. Anna Maria Luisa died on February 18, 1943, at the age of 76. She was buried in the Medici Chapel in the Basilica of San Lorenzo, the same church that Cosimo the Elder had rebuilt 3 centuries earlier in the same neighborhood where Giovanni di Bicci had opened his bank. Today, Florence receives roughly 15 million visitors a year. They come to see Michelangelo's David. They come to see Botticelli's Primavera. They come to stand inside the Duomo and look up at Brunelleschi's dome. They come, whether they know it or not, because of a family of bankers who understood that money, properly spent, could reshape the world, and because of one woman who made sure the evidence would never leave. The Medici were not saints. They were manipulators, schemers, and autocrats who dismantled a republic and replaced it with a dynasty. They produced popes who bankrupted the church and triggered a religious revolution. They maintained their power through patronage that was, at its core, a system of control. The beauty they funded was real, but so was the coercion that funded it. And yet, walk through the Uffizi on a Tuesday morning, when the light falls through the windows onto paintings that have hung in the same city for 500 years, and it is difficult to not feel something close to gratitude. The Medici bet that beauty would outlast power. They were right. The bank is gone. The duchy is gone. The popes are forgotten. But the art remains, exactly where Anna Maria Luisa insisted it would stay. A family of doctors turned bankers turned princes turned popes, and in the end, what survived was not the money, not the titles, not the thrones. It was the paintings on the wall.